We continue tracking breaking news. Former Omaha City Council member Vinny Palermo has agreed to plead guilty to the charges against him in that public corruption case.
In the Lincoln Federal Courthouse today, Palermo told a judge he was guilty of accepting benefits such as trips and luxury hotel rooms in exchange for his influence, helping to set up South Omaha nonprofits with turnback tax funds and permits to sell fireworks.
After the plea, Palermo returned to his jail cell in Saunders County, where he has been held for more than 3 months. John Chapman was in the courtroom this morning.
The former Omaha City Council member entered the federal courtroom here in Lincoln in handcuffs and shackles.
Vinny Palermo, usually seen dressed in suit and tie, was in jailhouse gear when he pled guilty to a U.S. District Court judge to one of 9 counts against him.
Based on her findings, she goes ahead and recommends to Judge Gerard in this case that he either accept the plea or reject the plea. And in this case, she's already indicated on the record that she's going to recommend that Judge Gerard accept the plea.
Palermo's attorney, Randy Paragas, says the sentencing judge is not obligated to take the plea deal. But if the deal is accepted, Palermo could spend 21 months in a federal prison and would have to pay restitution for the admitted crime.
The government will have an opportunity to put on what it thinks that the proper restitution would be in terms of loss to, in this case, the public, and then Mr. Palermo would be responsible for his portion of that, whatever the government could prove.
Attorney Paragas told reporters today that right now there is nothing to indicate that Palermo will provide testimony against the others charged in the case.
There's nothing on the table now that Mr. Palermo will be testifying against any of the other defendants in this matter.
After today's proceedings, Palermo was returned to jail. His attorney is working to get him out.
Yes, I'll be filing a detention motion to reopen the detention hearing, and I'll file that today, and I believe the detention hearing will be next Tuesday.
More than 3 months went by before Palermo decided to change his not guilty plea and offer a deal to the federal court.
As much as Mr. Palermo has been vilified and talked about and shamed, that in the end he did the right thing. He didn't drag the government through what would have been a horrific trial for the city of Omaha and for himself and for the government.
On your side in Lincoln, I'm John Chapman, 6 News.
Palermo will find out whether or not his deal will be accepted at his sentencing hearing set for November 16th. Another defendant in the case, retired Omaha Police Captain Richie Gonzalez, filed paperwork earlier in the week, and it's believed that Gonzalez will also work a deal with the federal government.